Tensions in the Middle East have reached a high after US military strikes destroyed 3 Iranian nuclear sites, although the extent of the damage yet to be really assessed. Following the attacks, several senior Iranian military leaders have threatened to respond to the US. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps spokesman Ibrahim Zolfagari says the US has directly entered the war and violated the sacred soil of Iran. He says the US will face heavy, regrettable and unpredictable consequences through powerful and targeted operations. Back on US soil, the Trump administration called the attacks a spectacular success. Looking at all the coverage yesterday, there were interesting reactions. Malcolm Rifkind, I saw him on Sky, he very much pro, saying Donald Trump did the right thing, the only thing to do. John Bolton, who has fallen out with Donald Trump but was in his first administration before he was dumped, also saying doesn't agree with Trump on a lot of things, but this was the right thing to do. And then you had the military, all the military experts sort of gasping in admiration at the audacity and the excellence of the operation itself. I didn't hear much in the way of criticism of the legality or otherwise of the operation.
Look, I think that one of the things that Donald Trump has achieved in his short time in his second term is a sense of the communication of his own power. And I think that we've got the NATO summit this week. You'd think that there would be at least some of the European and other NATO member leaders at least sort of paying lip service to the idea of de-escalation, they are saying, but barely anybody, I think with the exception of Ursula von der Leyen, barely anybody even questioning the legality. And that's because of, you talked there with Shashank there about the way that Iranian power is feared in some parts of the world. And it's the same right now with American power. And I think that's actually a problem. I think that what we're seeing in what's going on in recent weeks is really a breakdown of any of the acceptance of the international order and international institutions that for most of our life we've taken for granted. So the fact that, for example, one of the strongest voices of criticism has been Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations, but he just sounds so impotent in a way because Trump is making clear he doesn't really care what the United Nations think. And of course, what you've got you look at the Permanent Five on the United Nations, China desperately won't want the Straits of Hormuz to be closed because a lot of its oil goes through there. But equally, will be thinking, well, maybe if Trump can do this and nobody really complains about it, makes my task in relation to Taiwan easier. And in relation to Putin, another member of the Permanent Five, I mean, we're now in the kind of mad situation where Putin suggests himself to Donald Trump as a possible mediator between Iran and Israel. And even though he's engaged in, one of the bloodiest wars that Europe's seen since the Second World War, Trump sort of takes that at face value. So we're in a very, very, very different world to the one that, even a few years ago we felt we were living in.
Now, how dependent is Russia still on Iranian-made drones, or has it simply bought the technology from Iran and is manufacturing those drones to use against Ukraine itself?
Well, I mean, I don't know is the answer, but what I do know is that Russia and Iran have pretty close links politically, militarily, etc. And I think Putin will be not enjoying is the wrong word, but I think Putin will feel that this is a situation that is playing to his benefit in relation to Ukraine. Interesting, I feel two of the big casualties in this, one is Ukraine and one is Gaza, because the horror that you and I have talked about before that's going on in Gaza is continuing, but without the international spotlight that it had even up until recently because of what's since transpired in relation to Iran. And I noticed Zelensky's comments on Iran. Essentially, he's saying, praising Trump's leadership because he's basically wants the same sort of, absolutely all-out leadership in relation to to stopping Putin in Ukraine. And on the bigger points that you were discussing there with Shashank, and I don't know if Shashank is still listening, but he probably knows that Rory Stewart regularly calls him out as one of the great experts on these issues. But I do think this because of the way that Trump communicates, and J.D. Vance, of course, now sort of wants to echo that style of communication. Everything gets presented as very, very black and white. So, we completely and totally obliterated their nuclear sites. Well, I don't think they will have completely and totally obliterated their nuclear sites. And when they say this is limited and this is it, it's a one-off, and then we move on, they don't know that. Because
is that not simple wishful thinking? And they're saying this because they want to appease the MAGA base who cautioned, some of them who cautioned against going in the first place. So they're saying, oh, this is not against Iran. This is against Iran's nuclear program. I mean, let's cavil on the ninth part of a hair.
Well, Iran's nuclear program is, whether we like it or not, an important part of Iran's sense of its own self and its own strategy for the future. So, for example, I said on the podcast last night that the Iranians look at they've been pretty clear about saying that the Straits of Hormuz, they won't even think about closing it or partially closing it or mining it or making it more difficult to get supplies through there, unless they feel that their own national interest is being threatened. Well, when you've got Trump tweeting about, well, if you can't make Iran great again, what's wrong with regime change? That is quite a threat. And so, but I think this is the problem with the lack of the lack of respect for alliances, the lack of focus on the build-up. I've just been reading a really interesting piece in the New York Times, which is sort of examining the way that they're now recalibrating what they've been saying and doing as a sort of great act of genius and feinting and deliberate misinformation and so forth. So when he talked about 2 weeks, that was so that he already knew that he was going to go in 2 or 3 days, but he wanted to take them by surprise, etc. Now, I don't know the truth. I don't know what's actually been said within the American administration. But I think that what they do is to set themselves the line. They hammer the line very, very hard. They get the MAGA base in line. And to be fair, actually, most of them have fallen in line on the back of this. But as you say, by saying this is a one-off. But the trouble with that is that it depends on what the reaction of the Iranians is going to be. Shashank was talking there about some of the things that they might do. Imagine that there were a great cyber hit on America. Would the Americans feel they had to escalate? Maybe. If there was a hit on an American base, say in Iraq or Bahrain or wherever it might be, I don't think there'd be any doubt that Trump would feel he'd have to escalate. And so it depends now on what happens on the other side. They cannot take for granted that just because they say the consequences are as they expect them to be, that is what will happen. And so I think that, militarily, I think they're right to think this was an extraordinary operation. I mean, it really was. And I think will be, studied for years to come about how they did it, the feinting, the feinting with an E, that is the sending of
B-2s to Guam.
To Guam, to make and allowing them to be tracked, whereas the real ones weren't being tracked. And then the precision, we don't know yet the actual consequences of it. But however you look at this, whatever your arguments about legality or anything else, you can't deny that it's an amazing military act. Now, the consequences of that, I think, are still very, very unpredictable.
Yeah, the whole idea of this making the world a safer place because they've destroyed the nuclear possibilities, probably delayed them by several years, because there's no doubt under the current regime, which if it lasts, that nuclear program will be resuscitated. There's no question about that. But moving on to regime change, it's interesting that if regime change comes about on foot of the American involvement, this is an echo of the past, as you and I have mentioned before, when the UK and the US organized a coup in Iran back in the 50s.
Well, I thought you were going to talk about Iraq in 2003 there, but...
No, I know that's another...
that's another one we've talked about a lot in the past as well. Look, I reiterate the point I've just made, is that you cannot accurately predict what is now going to happen? And also, let's just say that there is regime change. What does the regime change to? And that I don't think any of us fully know the answer. You've got, I think, in Iran, a really interesting situation where the regime is pretty widely hated. Let's imagine a sort of on the one side, you've got a lot of quotes, real people who really don't like the regime and just want Iran to be become a normal functioning country, and then on the other side, in a way, you've got real hardliners who are looking for any sign of weakness in the response. So they are very, very vulnerable. And often what people do when they're very, very vulnerable is they lash out in unexpected directions. And don't forget as well, this is I think they're limited in what they can do, but that doesn't mean that they won't apply what we would define as irrational thinking to response that they might be putting together. And so I think that when we talk about regime change, and when Trump tweets, if you don't make Iran great again, what's wrong with regime change? Well, what's wrong with regime change? That question depends on what follows. And that I think we should be very, very wary of too.
By the way, in terms of Britain's response to this, I mean, I was reading that since 2022, there have been 20 plots uncovered by MI5, Iranian threats to Britain. And of course, you're in Cyprus, or were in Cyprus at the time of a British citizen of Azerbaijani descent spying on the base in Akrotiri in Cyprus. So is Iran a threat, and now an even bigger threat to British interests?
Well, yes, is the answer to that. And I mean, I think the British response has been interesting. You probably heard Rory Stewart on our podcast, very, very angry that neither Britain nor France nor Germany has even mentioned the possibility of at least observance of international law and not even having that debate. But I think that the focus of Keir Starmer's response seemed to me to be about an acceptance of the Iranian threat, not necessarily. I mean, he says as a fact it would be a danger to the world if Iran got its hand on a nuclear bomb. Now, what he wasn't saying is echoing the American view and the Israeli view that this is kind of, days, weeks ahead. Back to your earlier point about that, I think that and I know you calibrated it in the discussion with Shashank, but I don't think any of us can know that they've been set back by a year or 2 years, whatever it might be. And if they have, as Shashank seemed to be saying, managed to sort of get their enriched uranium in a place where the Americans have not been bombing in the last few days, then that might give them the thinking. This is what I go back to the point about making whether they're thinking rationally. They might just think, well, we're not as far advanced as we want to be, but we could actually get put together and whack off a dirty nuclear bomb pretty quickly. So this could accelerate them down a road that we don't want them to go down. That's why I say I think, your program and every program in the world will be getting people like me and Shashank on to give sort of what you would want to be considered and sort of definitive opinions. I think it's impossible to have definitive opinions right now. And that includes if you're the president of the United States or if you're the supreme leader in Iran, because they don't know the consequences of what they're doing right now.
The final point is about that call by European leaders for de-escalation from Merz and Macron and Keir Starmer. It's a bit late. It should have been a call on Trump to de-escalate before he did this. Because the instinct that many of us had is that if he's got a big bunker-busting bomb, he'll use it. That's the nature of the man.
Well, but if you follow that to the next step of that logic, Pat, that means that, if push came to shove, he wouldn't be averse to using a nuclear weapon either.
I think he's terrified of his own death, though, and that would be assured.
We've also heard, I wondered whether that, when he was talking about wanting to go down the diplomatic route, and we're not going to take out Khamenei, even though the Israelis say they know where he is. I mean, that could have just been a bit of sort of psychological warfare from Israel. But I wondered then whether that related to this sort of fear of death that Trump has, that people talk about. But I think, look, the guy is so unpredictable. And what you're seeing with world leaders, other world leaders like Merz, Macron, Starmer, Carney, and all the rest of them, is that there's no doubt they're calibrating their response out of a desire, I guess, to think that the limited influence they might have over him will be reduced if they call him out in any way. Now, I'm not convinced that's 100% right, but that is clearly what is driving a lot of their thinking. I saw Albanese's in Australia. His response was quite muted, but absolutely not a word of criticism of Trump. Why? In part because they know that Trump is currently reviewing the AUKUS, the deal between us and the Americans and Australia on future nuclear submarines in Australia. So these are all really big, difficult, complicated issues that most world leaders apply a bit of nuance and a bit of diplomacy. And I'm afraid that's what Trump doesn't do. He doesn't apply the nuance. We've obliterated it. Not, we hope that we've done some significant damage, but we've obliterated it. This has been the greatest military operation ever. Make Iran great again equals regime change. This sort of simple black and white approach, which is very effective in terms of sort of getting people to watch him on the TV and all that stuff, but it doesn't necessarily make for making the world a safer place. And it does seem very, very strange that he seems to be driven at the moment by this obsession about getting a Nobel Peace Prize, while his actions strike me as possibly going in the opposite direction.